Little girl grabbed his hand whispering, "Please save my mama tonight." The biker didn't hesitate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On a cold, stormy night, the sound of a little girl's desperate voice echoed through the empty streets. The wind howled, pushing her small figure to the edge of the road, where she stood trembling, her eyes filled with fear. "Please, save my mama tonight," she whispered, reaching out to a passing figure on a Harley-Davidson. The biker, a man known for his rough demeanor and intimidating presence, slowed down his bike. His leather jacket, adorned with the Hells Angels logo, made most people step aside in fear, but the little girl was different. She had no fear in her eyes. Instead, there was desperation. He could see the tear-streaked face of the girl, her small hand outstretched, and in her eyes, he saw a reflection of pain he knew all too well. Without a second thought, the biker stopped his bike. He knew that getting involved could mean trouble, but the girl's plea cut through the chaos of the night. The storm raged on, and in that moment, he made a choice that would alter the course of his life. The girl, with her trembling voice, explained how her mother was in danger. They were trapped in a house, with no one to help. The biker, who had spent years ignoring cries for help, now found himself in the midst of something he couldn't turn his back on. "Where is she?" the biker asked, his voice softer than he expected. The girl, clutching her jacket tightly, pointed to a nearby house, barely visible through the rain. Without hesitation, the biker revved his engine and signaled for the girl to hop on. As they sped toward the house, the biker's mind raced. Who would harm a mother and her child? What kind of danger awaited them? As the rain poured down harder, the urgency of the situation became even clearer. The biker's heart pounded, but he focused on the task at hand. He couldn't turn back. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. It felt like something far more personal. This was a battle he hadn't expected to fight. His hand tightened around the handlebars as they neared the house. Every instinct he had screamed at him to be ready. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a confrontation. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't going to walk away. The girl, still clutching his hand tightly, looked up at him with a mixture of hope and fear. She had no idea what was about to unfold, but the biker did. And as he slowed the bike, preparing to face whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. Muffled thunder rumbled in the distance as the biker sped down the rain-slicked street, his headlights cutting through the storm. The little girl, clutching tightly to his back, felt her heart race with every turn they took. She had led him to this run-down neighborhood, one that seemed forgotten by time and its inhabitants. As they neared the house, her grip tightened, and she whispered once more, her voice barely audible over the sound of the roaring engine. "Please save my mama." The biker didn't speak, but his mind was already racing. His heart, which had been hardened by years of battle and pain, seemed to soften with every mile that brought him closer to this unknown danger. The house came into view, a dilapidated two-story structure with broken windows and a cracked porch. It was clear that no one had taken care of it in years, and the silence that surrounded it felt more ominous than any sound the storm could create. He pulled the bike to a stop in front of the house, the engine idling as the rain poured down. The little girl slid off the bike, her feet landing in the mud with a soft thud. She didn't look back, her focus solely on the house ahead. "This is it," she said quietly, "they're inside." The biker stood still for a moment, his mind racing. The girl's urgency was palpable, and he knew that whatever was happening inside that house was not something he could walk away from. He glanced at the girl one last time before, pulling his leather jacket tighter around himself, making sure the weight of his gun holster was secure. He had to be ready for whatever awaited him. Without a word, he stepped off the bike, motioning for the girl to stay behind him. The storm seemed to intensify as they approached the porch, the wind howling louder as if warning them of the danger that lurked inside. He carefully stepped up onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots. His instincts, honed from years on the road, told him that he needed to move quietly, to avoid giving away his presence. But the door was slightly ajar, and with one swift motion, he pushed it open, stepping into the dark, musty interior. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of rain hitting the windows and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the dim light from a single bulb hanging above cast long shadows on the walls. The biker's eyes scanned the room, taking in the sparse furnishings and the broken furniture scattered around the room. And then he saw her, the woman, lying on the floor in a heap, her face battered and bruised. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, and her clothes torn. The biker's jaw tightened as he took a step closer. He knew who she was. She had to be the girl's mother. Without thinking, he knelt beside her, his hands gently lifting her into his arms. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. "Help me," she whispered, her voice weak and broken. The biker's heart clenched. He didn't know who had done this to her, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting her out of here. "We're going to get you out of here," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage that was building inside him. He looked toward the door, his instincts telling him to hurry. But just as he was about to stand, a voice from behind him froze him in place. "You're not going anywhere." The biker slowly turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the handle of his gun. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a cruel smile on his face. The man was holding a baseball bat, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "You picked the wrong house to come to, friend," the man said, his voice low and menacing. The biker's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening around the woman as he stood up. He could feel the heat of the man's gaze on him, but he wasn't afraid. This was what he had trained for, and he wasn't going to back down. "Get out of my way," the biker growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man laughed, swinging the bat in a wide arc. "You're not in charge here," he said. "But I am." The biker's heart pounded, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. The man took a step forward, the bat raised high, but before he could swing, the biker was already moving. In one fluid motion, he knocked the bat out of the man's hands, sending it skittering across the floor. The man staggered back in surprise, but the biker didn't hesitate. With a single punch, he knocked the man to the ground, his body crashing against the floor with a thud. The biker stood over him, breathing heavily, his eyes filled with cold determination. "You're not going to hurt anyone else," he said, his voice like ice. The man groaned in pain, but didn't get up. The biker didn't waste another second. He turned back to the woman in his arms and nodded at the little girl. "Let's go." They rushed out of the house, the storm still raging around them. But this time, it felt different. They were safe, and the biker knew that he had just saved a life. But as they walked to the bike, the little girl looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper. She knew that this wasn't the end of the story. And the biker, for the first time in a long while, felt like he was part of something that mattered. The storm continued to howl around them as they made their way back to the biker's motorcycle. The little girl, still gripping his jacket, glanced up at him with wide eyes filled with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. He could feel the weight of her gaze, and despite the chaos of the night, he felt a strange connection with her. He had saved her mother, yes, but there was something more, something deeper that tugged at him. As they approached the bike, he helped the woman onto the back, gently guiding her to sit, making sure she was stable before handing her the helmet. The little girl climbed on behind her mother, clutching the woman's waist, and the biker revved the engine. The sound of the motorcycle engine filled the night, the roar of the bike a stark contrast to the stillness of the neighborhood they were leaving behind. The ride back to his garage was slower this time, more deliberate. The weight of what had just happened settled on him. He hadn't expected any of this. He wasn't the type to play hero, especially not for someone he didn't know, but tonight had been different. Maybe it was the girl's innocence, or maybe it was the feeling that he couldn't turn his back on them, not after everything he had been through. As they pulled up to his garage, the rain had finally started to subside. The biker could see the faintest traces of moonlight peeking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the old building. He parked the bike and helped the woman off, steadying her as she took a step toward the door. The little girl hopped off, looking up at him with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. The biker nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wasn't used to this. People didn't thank him for anything, especially not for doing the right thing. but something about this felt different. He opened the door to the garage, the familiar scent of motor oil and old leather filling the air. The woman stepped inside, still unsteady on her feet, and the biker guided her to the small cot in the corner where he usually slept. He didn't have much, but it was enough to offer her some comfort. The little girl settled beside her mother, clutching the woman's hand as she whispered something to her, but the biker couldn't hear the words. He stepped back, giving them space. He didn't belong here, not in this world of family and tenderness. He was a biker, an enforcer with a past he couldn't outrun. His life had been filled with violence, betrayal, and loss. He wasn't meant to be a hero, but tonight, for some reason, he had chosen to be. As the woman and child settled down to rest, the biker went to his workbench. The sounds of tools clinking against metal providing a strange sense of comfort. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. This was not a chapter he could close easily. He stood there for a while, lost in thought, before he heard a soft voice behind him. "You're staying, aren't you?" It was the little girl, standing in the doorway, watching him. He turned to face her, his brow furrowed in confusion. She stepped forward, her small feet padding against the concrete floor, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "You're not going to leave us, are you?" she asked again, her voice filled with uncertainty. The biker felt a pang in his chest, a feeling he hadn't had in years: responsibility. He had always run from anything that tied him down, but this was different. He had already crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. The girl smiled, a small but genuine smile, before running back to her mother. The biker stood there for a moment, processing the weight of his own words. He had made a promise, and this time, it wasn't a promise he planned to break. As he turned back to the workbench, a thought crossed his mind. He had never been the type to be needed, but now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The night was still far from over, but as he stood in the dim light of his garage, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away from this. He would see it through, no matter what. He wasn't just saving a life tonight. He was changing his own. The days that followed were a blur of rain, cold nights, and quiet conversations. The biker, who had always kept to himself, now found himself caring for someone else. Two someone else's, to be exact. He had no idea what had drawn him into this strange new responsibility. It wasn't the kind of life he had chosen, and yet, there he was. The woman, whose name was Sarah, slowly recovered under his care. The little girl, Emily, had been a quiet presence at his side, never far from her mother. The biker had become their protector, their unwitting guardian. Despite his rough exterior, there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the bond that was beginning to form between them. Sarah had barely spoken of the past, but the little bits she let slip were enough to make him understand just how much she had suffered. The scars, both visible and hidden, were something he recognized. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone broken by violence, but something about Sarah's eyes told him she wasn't just another victim. She was strong, stronger than she realized. Emily, on the other hand, was a constant reminder of innocence. The little girl had barely spoken about what had happened. She seemed to trust him without hesitation, but it was clear she still feared for her mother's safety. One morning, after a particularly long night of rain, Sarah sat on the edge of the cot, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. The biker watched from across the room, noticing the tension in her shoulders. He knew she was struggling. He had seen the signs before, emotional wounds that were far harder to heal than physical ones. The sound of Emily's laughter, coming from the corner of the garage where she had been playing with a few old tools the biker had left lying around, broke the tension in the air. The girl's presence was a balm for them all, reminding them that even in the darkest times, there was still light. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've saved us." The biker didn't know how to respond. His words felt hollow, as though there was nothing he could say that would undo the pain they had both endured. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging her thanks. But inside, something stirred. He had never been the type to stick around, never the kind to offer comfort. Yet here he was, offering both to people he barely knew. He had spent years running from his past, but now he felt like he was being pulled into something he couldn't escape. He was getting involved, and it was starting to matter. That evening, as the night fell and the garage grew quieter, the biker took a seat near the small stove he had set up in the corner. Emily sat on the floor beside him, a drawing of a house in her hands. "Do you think we'll ever get to go back home?" she asked, her voice soft. The biker looked at her, his heart sinking at the question. He didn't know the answer. He didn't know what the future held for them. He could feel the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on him. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly at the other end of the room, glanced over at them. She caught the look on the biker's face and smiled faintly. "It's okay," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "We'll be all right, Emily. We're safe now." The biker didn't say anything, but the truth was, he wasn't sure about that. He knew that the danger wasn't over, that whoever had hurt Sarah and Emily was still out there, still lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running. He wasn't alone either. The silence between them was comfortable, and the warmth from the stove seemed to settle deep in his bones. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Comfort, safety. He didn't know how long it would last, but he wasn't ready to give it up. "We'll be all right," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The next morning, the biker knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't keep hiding in the garage, hoping the world would leave them alone. He had to face whatever threat was out there. But he couldn't do it alone. He turned to Sarah, who was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in her hands. Her eyes met his, and she seemed to understand immediately. "You're going to protect us, aren't you?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice firm. It was a promise he intended to keep. As the day wore on, the biker prepared for what lay ahead. He didn't know what kind of danger they were facing, but he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away this time. He was going to make sure that Sarah and Emily had a future, one that was far different from the past they had left behind. The following days were spent in a strange mix of normalcy and tension. The biker had made his promise to Sarah and Emily, and now, more than ever, he felt the weight of that promise. The garage, once a place of solitude and refuge for him, now felt like a home, a place filled with the presence of two people who depended on him. Every morning, Emily would wake early, her small feet padding across the cold concrete floor as she would start drawing again. The little girl had an endless supply of drawings, all filled with images of houses, flowers, and sometimes, in the corner of her sketches, a small stick figure of a man wearing a leather jacket. The biker would watch her from the doorway, wondering what she was really thinking. He knew she was trying to make sense of the new life they were starting to build, even if it wasn't what she had hoped for. Sarah, for her part, was slowly regaining her strength. The bruises on her body were healing, but the scars, both seen and unseen, would take much longer. Every time their eyes met, the biker could see the gratitude in her gaze, but also something else, something deeper. She was thankful, but she was also scared. There was no mistaking the look in her eyes. She had lived through something horrible, and she wasn't sure if she could ever truly be safe. The biker couldn't blame her. The past few weeks had opened his eyes to the depths of pain that people like Sarah carried, and he realized that his rough exterior wasn't enough to shield him from the emotions that began to surface. One night, as the rain began to pour once more, the biker sat in his chair by the stove, listening to the sound of the storm outside. Emily was asleep, her head resting on the arm of the old couch, while Sarah sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, and the biker, for the first time in a long while, felt the need to break that silence. "I need to do something," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wary. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker stood up, stretching his stiff muscles as he moved toward the workbench. "I can't just hide here anymore," he said, grabbing his jacket and slipping it on. "There's someone out there who did this to you, and I'm not going to let them get away with it." Sarah's eyes widened, her face paling as she stood up. "You can't. It's too dangerous. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they'll do." The biker turned to face her, his jaw set in determination. "I've dealt with danger before, Sarah. It's not the first time I've faced it. But this time, I'm not doing it alone. I'm going to make sure you and Emily are safe, no matter what." Sarah shook her head, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. I don't want you to risk your life for us. I don't want anyone else to get hurt. The biker walked over to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. I understand more than you think. But you've been through too much, and I can't stand by and let them win. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. The silence hung between them for a long moment before Sarah finally nodded, her eyes filled with reluctant acceptance. Just promise me you'll be careful, she said softly. The biker smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. I'll be careful, he said, though the edge in his voice suggested he was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, he prepared himself for what was to come. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it was time to face whatever threat had been looming over them all this time. He checked his gun, strapped his knife to his belt, and made sure his bike was ready. As he stepped outside, the early morning mist hung in the air, and the streets were still empty. The world seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath for the inevitable confrontation. The biker didn't waste any time. He revved the engine, the roar of the Harley cutting through the stillness of the morning. As he sped off, his thoughts turned to Sarah and Emily. They were safe for now, but for how long? He couldn't let this go on. He had to find the person who had hurt them. He had to stop them. The streets were familiar to him, but now they felt different, darker. The biker was used to being on the move, always running from something, never staying in one place too long. But now, for the first time, he was chasing something. And it wasn't just revenge. It was protection. He had to protect them, Sarah and Emily. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was prepared for the long road ahead. As he rode through the streets, his mind raced with plans, with thoughts of what could happen next. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. He had to stay focused, stay sharp. As he turned the corner, he saw it, the place where he knew the answers lay. The biker slowed down, pulling the Harley to a stop just outside a small, nondescript building. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. This was it. This was where it would all end. The biker slowed his Harley, the sound of the engine fading as he neared the small, nondescript building. It was a place he had passed by many times before, never paying much attention to it. But tonight, it was different. He could feel the tension in the air, thick with the promise of what was to come. The woman and child were safe, for now, but the danger wasn't over. Whoever had hurt Sarah and Emily was still out there, and the biker knew this was his chance to put an end to it. He parked the bike a few yards away, the headlights casting long shadows across the ground. The building in front of him was abandoned, a warehouse that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The windows were boarded up, and the door was slightly ajar, just enough to make it seem like an invitation or a trap. He didn't hesitate. The biker stood still for a moment, letting the night settle around him. He had dealt with threats before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was personal. He walked toward the door, his boots crunching on the gravel, the weight of the gun in his holster a reminder of the danger ahead. As he reached for the door, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the same feeling that had carried him through countless dangerous situations. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. This time, he was fighting for something more. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind outside. He moved carefully, his steps quiet as he made his way deeper into the building. His eyes scanned the shadows, every corner a potential hiding place for whoever was waiting for him. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the far corner, shrouded in darkness. The biker's hand instinctively went to his gun, but before he could draw it, the figure stepped forward, revealing a man with a cold smile on his face. I was wondering when you'd show up, the man said, his voice low and smooth. The biker's pulse quickened, but he didn't show any sign of fear. You've got a lot of nerve, the biker growled, taking a step toward the man. The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty space. You think you're the only one who can play the hero? He asked, his eyes glinting with malice. You're too late. The girl and her mother are already gone. The biker's heart skipped a beat. What did you do to them? He demanded, his voice tight with rage. The man shrugged nonchalantly. Don't worry about them. They're safe, for now. But you and I, we have unfinished business. The biker took a step closer, his fingers brushing the handle of his gun. If you think I'm walking away from this, you're wrong, he said, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. The man's smile widened. We'll see about that, he said, before raising his hand and signaling. Suddenly, the biker heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around just in time to see two more men emerge from the shadows, each holding a weapon. The biker's instincts kicked in. He drew his gun in a flash, aiming at the closest man. But before he could fire, the man lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand and sending it skittering across the floor. The biker fought back, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a brutal punch that sent him stumbling back. But there was no time to savor the victory. The second man rushed at him, swinging a metal pipe. The biker ducked just in time, the pipe missing his head by inches. He retaliated with a quick jab to the man's stomach, followed by a knee to the chest that sent the man crashing to the ground. The biker turned his attention back to the man in the corner, who was watching the fight with a cold, calculating expression. "You're going to regret this," the biker warned him, wiping the blood from his lip. "Not if I can help it," the man replied, pulling out a knife and advancing toward him. The biker knew he had to end this, and fast. He moved quickly, dodging the man's strike and countering with a punch to his face that knocked him off balance. The man staggered back, but before he could recover, the biker grabbed him by the throat and slammed him into the wall. "This ends now," the biker growled, his grip tightening. The man's eyes widened in fear, and for a moment, it looked like he was about to break. But then, with a final effort, he shoved the biker away, sending him crashing to the ground. The biker struggled to get back on his feet, his body aching from the fight. He knew he was running out of time. The man was scrambling for his knife, but the biker was quicker. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground and pinning him down. With one swift motion, he twisted the man's arm, disarming him and rendering him powerless. The room was silent now, except for the sound of the biker's heavy breathing. He looked at the man beneath him, his face hard and unforgiving. "This is over," he said, his voice cold. The man didn't respond, only staring up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. The biker stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow. He had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. He still had to find Sarah and Emily. He couldn't rest until they were safe, and he wasn't going to stop until he made sure the people who had hurt them would never hurt anyone else again. The biker stood in the dimly lit warehouse, his body aching from the brutal fight, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He had dealt with the immediate threat, but there was still more to be done. He couldn't let his guard down now. The man he had just subdued was a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and the biker knew it was. Only a matter of time before someone else came looking for him. He grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him to his feet with ease. The man groaned, his face bloodied and bruised, but the biker didn't show any sympathy. "Where are they?" the biker demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. "Who?" he muttered, feigning ignorance. The biker's grip tightened. "Don't play games with me. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Sarah and Emily." The man swallowed hard, fear creeping into his eyes. "I don't know where they are," he spat. "I'm just a middleman." The biker didn't buy it for a second. He could see the fear in the man's eyes, the way his hands shook, and he knew that this man knew more than he was letting on. "You're not going anywhere until you tell me what I need to know," the biker said, his tone icy. The man hesitated, his gaze shifting from the biker to the exit. He was weighing his options, and the biker could tell that he was considering running. But before the man could make a move, the biker slammed him against the wall, pinning him with one arm. "I'm not asking again," the biker growled. The man winced in pain, but finally spoke. All right. I know where they are, but you'll never make it out alive if you go after them." The biker didn't care about threats. He had heard them all before. "Tell me," he demanded. The man took a deep breath, and his voice faltered as he spoke. "There's a safe house. It's hidden, far from here. But it's not just some safe place. It's a trap. If you go there, you'll be walking right into it. They've got men watching the place, waiting for someone like you to come sniffing around." The biker's mind was racing, but he kept his expression stoic. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It had turned into a war. "How many men?" he asked, his voice steady. The man gulped, his voice trembling as he answered, "A dozen. At least. They'll be armed, and they'll be ready for anything." The biker nodded. A dozen men wasn't a problem. He had faced worse odds before. "Where is it?" he asked, already reaching for his jacket. The man hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something else, but the biker's glare silenced him. "In the mountains," the man said finally. There's an old cabin, isolated. It's the perfect place to hide, but it's also the perfect place to trap someone. The biker turned without a second thought, heading for the door. He had a destination now, and he wasn't going to waste any more time. The man's voice echoed in the room as the biker walked away. You're making a mistake, he called out weakly, but the biker didn't respond. He knew what he was doing. He had been trained for moments like this, and he had never backed down from a fight. As he revved the engine and sped down the road, his thoughts were on Sarah and Emily. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he had to save them. He couldn't let them fall into the hands of people who had shown no mercy. He wouldn't let them down. The road ahead was dark, but the biker's mind was clear. He was going to get to that cabin, and he was going to rescue them. He didn't care how many men stood in his way. As the bike roared down the highway, the biker's thoughts shifted to the larger picture. The life he had known, the life of an enforcer, a lone wolf, was beginning to feel more and more distant. He had made promises to protect them, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about finding redemption. The mountains loomed in the distance, and the biker pushed the throttle harder, the wind whipping past him as he closed in on the place where everything would come to a head. This was the moment that would decide everything. He wasn't just going to fight for Sarah and Emily. He was fighting for his own chance at a life that meant something. The biker's heart pounded in his chest as he navigated the winding mountain roads. The cold wind whipped through his leather jacket, but it was nothing compared to the heat of the moment. His destination loomed ahead, the isolated cabin where Sarah and Emily were supposed to be hidden, where he had to face whatever dangers awaited. The information from the man in the warehouse echoed. In his mind, dozen armed men, a trap, and no way out. But the biker had no intention of backing down. He wasn't just riding for them. He was riding for himself. He was determined to put an end to this twisted game, to bring safety to the woman and child he had promised to protect. As the night deepened, the biker's thoughts sharpened, focusing solely on the task ahead. He couldn't afford distractions, not now. The mountain pass was treacherous, the asphalt slick with rain, but he had ridden in worse conditions. He had been to places far darker than this, fought men who were just as ruthless, if not more. The difference now was that it wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just survival. This time, he had a reason to fight. He had something to protect. The cabin came into view, nestled at the edge of the clearing. A single light flickered from inside, casting a faint glow through the trees. The biker slowed the motorcycle, pulling it off the main road and hiding it behind a thick cluster of trees. He couldn't afford to make any noise now. Stealth was his only ally. He crept closer to the cabin, his senses alert to every movement in the darkness. His eyes scanned the area, looking for signs of movement, any indication that the men he had been warned about were nearby. The cold air bit at his skin as he moved closer, crouching low to avoid being seen. The cabin was still, almost eerily quiet, and for a moment, the biker thought it might be a trap. But he couldn't turn back now. He had come too far. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, before slipping around to the back of the cabin. There was a small window, barely visible through the overgrown vines and ivy. The biker approached cautiously, peering inside. His breath caught in his throat when he saw Sarah and Emily, sitting on the floor by a dimly lit fire. The sight of them, alive and safe for now, brought a wave of relief that almost made him forget why he was there. But the biker couldn't afford to relax. He knew the danger wasn't over. He scanned the room again, his eyes narrowing as he noticed a shadow moving in the far corner. One of the men. He was pacing back and forth, keeping an eye on Sarah and Emily. The biker's blood ran cold. He couldn't risk waiting any longer. He had to move in. Quietly, he crept around the side of the cabin, making his way toward the front door. He reached for the handle, but then he froze. A voice. "You hear that?" One of the men called out from behind the door. The biker's heart skipped a beat. They knew someone was out there. He had to think fast. Without hesitation, he dropped to the ground, rolling behind a stack of firewood just in time to avoid being seen. The men were getting closer, their boots crunching on the gravel. The biker held his breath, his hand resting on the grip of his gun, ready for whatever came next. The two men stepped out, their eyes scanning the darkness, but they didn't see him. "You sure you heard something?" the first man asked, his voice low. "Maybe you're just jumpy. We've got this place locked down tight." No one's getting in. The second man grunted in agreement, but the biker knew better. They didn't know what he was capable of. They didn't know who they were dealing with. He waited for the perfect moment, his mind calculating every move. The moment the men turned their backs, he was on them. He sprang from his hiding spot, taking the first man down with a swift punch to the jaw, his body hitting the ground with a thud. The second man reacted quickly, reaching for his gun, but the biker was faster. In one fluid motion, he knocked the weapon from the man's hand and tackled him to the ground. The struggle was brief. With a quick strike, the biker knocked the man unconscious, leaving him crumpled on the ground. He stood over the two men, catching his breath. They were out, but the fight wasn't over yet. He had to get inside and make sure Sarah and Emily were safe. He quickly moved toward the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. He entered the cabin, his eyes immediately finding Sarah and Emily, who were now standing. Their faces a mixture of fear and hope. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw him. "You came," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. The biker nodded, but there was no time for words. "We need to go now," he said, his voice urgent. Emily took her mother's hand, and they followed him as he led them toward the back door. The biker knew they weren't safe yet. The other men were still out there, and they would be coming for them soon. He had to move fast. He turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "You stay close to me. No matter what happens, stay with me." She nodded, her face pale but resolute. The biker led them out the back, keeping low to avoid being seen. His heart raced as they made their way through the trees, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like they had a chance. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for them, and he wasn't going to stop until they were free. The biker moved through the trees, his body tense, every muscle ready for a fight. Sarah and Emily were close behind him, their footsteps barely making a sound on the wet ground. The night was still, the only sounds the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. The biker kept his eyes sharp, scanning the darkness for any movement. They weren't safe yet. The danger was still out there, and they had to move fast. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind him. Two men, moving quickly. He signaled for Sarah and Emily to stay low, crouching down next to a thick tree trunk to shield themselves from view. The biker's heart was pounding in his chest. They had made it this far, but the real test was yet to come. The men were getting closer, their voices growing louder. The biker felt a cold rush of adrenaline as he saw the men pass by, only a few feet from their hiding spot. They didn't see them. The biker held his breath, waiting until the last of the men had passed. When he was sure they were gone, he motioned for Sarah and Emily to follow him. They moved quickly, silently, through the dense forest, the thick underbrush making every step harder. The biker's mind was racing, calculating their next move. He knew they had to get to the road, but the mountain pass was treacherous, and they couldn't risk running into more of the men. As they moved deeper into the woods, the biker noticed something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing in the shadows, just ahead. He signaled for Sarah and Emily to stop and duck behind a nearby boulder, his heart beating faster. The figure didn't move. It was watching them. The biker's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he didn't draw it yet. He had to be sure. Slowly, cautiously, he crept forward, his boots barely making a sound. His eyes stayed locked on the figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. The biker's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held back, waiting for the right moment. Just as he was about to make his move, the figure turned, disappearing into the trees. The biker cursed under his breath. This was a trap, and they had walked right into it. He quickly moved back to Sarah and Emily, his mind racing. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice low but firm. They couldn't stay here much longer. They had to keep moving. He had no intention of letting anyone get between him and Sarah and Emily. The biker led them through the trees, his senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustling of leaves had him on edge. He was used to danger, but this felt different. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about protecting them, and that made everything feel even more urgent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the biker spotted the edge of the forest, the road just beyond. He motioned for Sarah and Emily to follow him, but as they moved toward the clearing, the biker's instincts flared once more. He stopped suddenly, his hand shooting out to stop Sarah. A faint noise, footsteps, soft but deliberate. The biker's eyes scanned the area, trying to pinpoint the sound. There. Movement in the distance, just beyond the trees. Someone was following them. He motioned for Sarah and Emily to duck behind a fallen log, his body low to the ground. The biker's heart raced as he crept toward the clearing, his eyes locked on the figure approaching. The man was alone, but the biker wasn't taking any chances. He was ready. The figure got closer, and the biker recognized him. One of the men from the cabin. The man's face was twisted in a grimace, and he was carrying a rifle. The biker's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he stayed hidden, waiting for the right moment. The man walked right into the clearing, stopping just a few feet away from where Sarah, Emily, and the biker were hiding. The tension in the air was thick, and the biker could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He had to make his move now. With a quick motion, the biker stood, firing a shot that hit the man square in the chest. The man collapsed, his rifle falling to the ground with a loud clatter. Sarah gasped, her hand clutching Emily, but the biker didn't have time to reassure them. He grabbed them both by the arms, pulling them toward the road. "We need to move. Now," he said, his voice urgent. They ran. The sound of footsteps pounding behind them grew louder, but the biker didn't look back. He knew they were running out of time. As they reached the road, the biker saw the headlights of a car approaching. He didn't hesitate. He flagged the car down, signaling for them to stop. The car skidded to a halt, the driver rolling down the window. "You need to get us out of here," the biker said, his voice sharp. The driver, a man in his late 30s, looked at the biker with confusion. "What's going on? Who are you?" "Just get us out of here," the biker repeated. The driver hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Get in." They didn't waste any time. The biker, Sarah, and Emily climbed into the back of the car, and the driver floored the gas pedal, taking off down the road. The biker's eyes never left the rearview mirror. He wasn't sure how many men were chasing them, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. The road was narrow, winding through the mountains, and the car's headlights were their only source of light. The biker's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. They had made it this far, but it wasn't over. He wasn't going to stop until Sarah and Emily were safe, and he would fight anyone who stood in his way. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in days, the biker felt a small sense of relief. They were getting away, and he wasn't going to let anything take them away from him. The car sped through the winding mountain roads, the headlights slicing through the night as the biker, Sarah, and Emily huddled in the back seat. The sound of the engine roared, filling the silence with urgency. The man driving, a stranger, glanced nervously in the rearview mirror every few seconds, but said nothing. The biker knew better than to ask questions. They had already attracted enough attention, and every second spent on the road was another second they were in danger. Emily was quiet, her small frame pressed up against her mother, her eyes wide and alert, scanning the road ahead. Sarah, too, was silent, her face pale, exhausted from the stress of the past few days. The biker's gaze never left the rearview mirror, his grip tight on the seat, his body coiled with tension. He knew they weren't out of danger yet. They had made it this far, but there was still a long way to go. The men who had been after them were not the kind to let a failure slide easily. It wouldn't be long before they came looking for them again. The road stretched on, dark and lonely, with the occasional flicker of lights from passing cars. The biker's mind raced, strategizing their next move. He had no plan, just the instinct to keep moving, keep them safe. The driver, seemingly sensing the growing tension in the car, finally spoke. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know. Just keep driving," the biker replied curtly. "Just keep driving until I tell you to stop." The driver hesitated but nodded. "All right, but you've got to tell me what's going on. Who were those men? And why are they after you?" The biker didn't answer. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to the confrontation earlier. He had taken down 2 of the men, but he knew it wasn't over. There would be more. And the truth was, he couldn't protect them forever. He didn't have the resources, the connections, or the safety that a normal man might have. But he had something more important, resolve. He had a promise to keep. He would do whatever it took to make sure Sarah and Emily were safe, no matter what. The car continued to race through the dark, the headlights illuminating nothing but more miles of empty road. But as the biker's mind whirled, a nagging thought began to creep in. What if they couldn't outrun the danger? What if they couldn't get far enough away? What if the men were waiting for them, just around the next bend? Just as the tension in the car reached a breaking point, the driver suddenly slowed, looking at the rearview mirror with a panicked expression. "There's a car behind us," he said, his voice trembling. The biker's instincts flared. He glanced back, but the car was too far behind to make out clearly. He could feel his pulse quicken as the vehicle began to close the distance. The driver looked at him, waiting for instruction. The biker didn't hesitate. "Get off the road," he ordered. The driver nodded quickly, swerving off onto a narrow dirt path that ran parallel to the main highway. The car bounced as it hit the rough terrain, but the biker didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations. They had to keep moving, and fast. The sound of the pursuing car grew louder, its engine revving as it followed them down the dirt path. The biker reached for his gun, his hands steady, his body still. He wasn't going to let them catch up. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. The car bumped and jostled as they sped down the path, the headlights flashing wildly, casting strange shadows across the trees. The driver looked over at the biker, fear in his eyes. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice strained. "Keep driving," the biker said, his voice calm but filled with authority. He didn't have time for hesitation. He didn't have time to second-guess his decisions. The pursuing car was getting closer. He could hear the sound of its tires skidding against the dirt, the engine revving with a power that matched their own. He knew they couldn't keep this up for long. The biker's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. He needed a plan. Fast. As they rounded a bend, he spotted something up ahead, an old bridge, narrow and weathered, but it could be their ticket out. "Take that bridge," the biker ordered. The driver's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "Do it," the biker said, his voice firm. The driver didn't question him again. He slammed his foot on the gas, sending the car hurtling toward the bridge. The wooden structure creaked and groaned under the weight, but it held strong as they crossed it at full speed. The pursuing car wasn't as lucky. As the car behind them approached the bridge, the biker watched in the rearview mirror as the car hesitated, then swerved. The driver had misjudged the turn, and the car went off the edge, crashing into the trees below with a loud crash. The biker didn't slow down. He knew this wasn't over. There would be more. But for now, they had a moment of respite. The car sped on, the sound of the crash fading into the distance as they crossed the bridge and continued down the road. The biker looked at Sarah and Emily, who were both huddled in the back seat, silent but safe for now. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in days, the biker allowed himself a small moment of relief. They were still alive, and he wasn't going to let that change. The car continued to speed through the narrow mountain roads, the sound of the engine humming low but constant. The night had settled into an eerie silence after the crash, and the biker could feel the weight of what had just happened. The crash they'd narrowly escaped hadn't been by chance. The biker knew they weren't out of danger yet. The people chasing them weren't the kind to let a mistake slide. They were relentless, and their failure tonight would only fuel their pursuit. Sarah and Emily were quiet in the back seat, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. The biker could sense their anxiety, but he wasn't sure how to reassure them. He had never been good with words, never had the luxury of comforting someone. All he had ever known was action, and he was acting now. He had no plan for what came next, just the instinct to keep moving, keep them safe. The car hit a bump, and the driver looked nervously in the rearview mirror, checking to see if anyone was following. The biker's eyes flicked to the mirror as well, scanning the night for any sign of pursuit. There was nothing yet, but the biker knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They had to get to safety, but where could they go? The man driving the car seemed increasingly nervous, his eyes darting to the mirror and back to the road. "Are we safe?" he asked, his voice shaking. "No," the biker replied bluntly, his gaze still fixed on the road ahead. The driver's eyes widened, but he didn't argue. He had already seen enough to know that the biker wasn't a man who wasted words. "Then what do we do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The biker looked at him, his expression cold and unreadable. "We keep driving. We don't stop." The driver nodded, though the tension in his face didn't ease. They continued on, the car winding its way through the mountains, and with each passing mile, the biker could feel the weight of their situation pressing down harder. They were running, but to where? There was no safe place for them, nowhere they could hide forever. The thought gnawed at him. He wasn't used to relying on anyone. He had always been a lone wolf, taking care of his own problems, solving his own battles. But now, it wasn't just about him. It was about Sarah and Emily. He had promised to protect them, and no matter the cost, he would keep that promise. Hours seemed to pass as they continued driving, the road stretching on, endless and unforgiving. Finally, the driver slowed down, pulling the car off the main road and into a small, secluded area surrounded by trees. The biker tensed, but the driver assured him, "This is a safe spot. No one knows about this place." The biker didn't trust it, but he didn't have time to argue. They had to regroup. "We stay here for the night," the biker said, his voice firm. "We rest, then move again at first light." The driver nodded, but the unease in his eyes remained. As they stepped out of the car, the biker surveyed their surroundings. The place seemed quiet, too quiet. He didn't want to let his guard down, not for a second. The wind rustled through the trees, and the sound of distant wildlife was the only thing that broke the silence. He turned to Sarah and Emily, who had stayed close to each other in the back seat. Emily looked up at him, her face full of questions, but she didn't ask any. She had learned to trust him, even without words. Sarah, though, seemed more uncertain. She had been through too much to feel truly safe. The biker could see the fear in her eyes, the way she gripped Emily's hand tightly as they stood outside. "We're all right," he said quietly, though even he wasn't sure if he believed the words. Sarah looked at him, her lips trembling slightly. "But for how long?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The biker didn't have an answer. The truth was, he didn't know. They had outrun one danger, but there was more to come. He had been in situations before where it felt like they were constantly running, always looking over their shoulder. But this time, it felt different. This time, he had more than just himself to think about, and that made everything harder. He took a deep breath and turned back to the car, pulling out a small bag of supplies from the trunk. They would need to rest for a few hours, but he couldn't afford to be comfortable. There was no such thing as comfort in his world. Not anymore. He handed Sarah and Emily each a small blanket, settling down near the edge of the car. Emily curled up with her mother. The two of them huddled together for warmth, while the biker kept watch. As the night wore on, the sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder, the wind picking up, making the trees creak and moan. The biker didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind raced, running through every possible scenario, every move they might have to make in the coming days. His eyes stayed fixed on the shadows, constantly searching for any sign of movement. He didn't trust the quiet. But despite his vigilance, exhaustion began to set in. His body ached from the tension, from the constant running. He had been through so much, but something in him told him this was just the beginning. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the biker stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. He turned to Sarah and Emily, who were still asleep, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. The biker knew it wouldn't last. They couldn't stay here long. They had to keep moving. He took one last look around, then climbed back into the car. "We move at first light," he muttered to himself, "no matter what." And with that, he started the engine once more, ready to continue the fight, knowing that he wouldn't stop until Sarah and Emily were truly safe. The sun had barely risen as the car rumbled down the winding mountain road. The biker kept his eyes on the horizon, his knuckles white from gripping the seat. The faint glow of the early morning light illuminated the road ahead, but his mind was still clouded with tension. Sarah and Emily were silent in the back seat, their quiet breathing a small comfort in the otherwise tense air. The driver, who had been their reluctant ally, seemed nervous, glancing occasionally at the biker as though expecting him to say something, but the biker remained silent. He had learned long ago that words were a luxury he couldn't afford in moments like these. Action was what mattered. As the road stretched on, the biker felt the weight of the promise he had made to Sarah and Emily. He was their protector now, whether he liked it or not, and no matter how dangerous the road ahead might be, he wasn't going to stop until they were truly safe. The car continued through the mountains, the dense forest around them offering little cover. The biker knew they had to find a place to lie low, somewhere they could regroup and plan their next move. He glanced at the driver. "Pull over," he ordered quietly. The driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror before nodding and pulling the car off the road. They had come to a small, secluded clearing surrounded by trees. The biker's instincts screamed that they needed to stay off the main roads, to avoid being seen at all costs. As the car stopped, The biker immediately opened the door and stepped out, scanning the area for any signs of danger. It was too quiet. The air felt thick, like the calm before the storm. He motioned for Sarah and Emily to stay inside the car while he took a look around. Moving quickly, he crouched low to the ground, using the trees for cover. His eyes swept over the clearing, searching for any movement. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the silence pressed down on him. The faintest sound, a rustling in the bushes, caught his attention. His hand went instinctively to his gun, but he held still. It could have been an animal, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He moved toward the sound, keeping his body low, and his movements deliberate. As he approached the bush, his eyes narrowed, and his breath caught when he saw a figure emerge from behind the trees. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a rifle. The biker froze, his mind racing. Had the men from the cabin found them already? He couldn't afford to get caught off guard. Without making a sound, he slipped behind a large rock, his body pressed flat against the cold stone. The man walked closer, his steps slow and cautious. The biker's heartbeat quickened as he waited for the perfect moment. He could feel the tension building inside him, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to react at any moment. The man was only a few feet away when he stopped, looking around, his eyes scanning the clearing. The biker didn't move. He couldn't risk being spotted. The man was looking directly at him now, but somehow, he didn't see him. The biker held his breath, praying the man wouldn't turn. He couldn't afford a mistake now. The man stood there for a moment longer, and just as the biker thought he might be discovered, the man turned, walking away, his attention drifting elsewhere. The biker exhaled slowly, relief flooding him. He waited a few more seconds before moving back toward the car. His mind was still on high alert, but he allowed himself a brief moment of calm as he returned to Sarah and Emily. "We need to keep moving," the biker said, his voice steady. "There's no time to waste." The driver nodded but didn't speak. Sarah and Emily remained quiet in the back seat, the tension between them thick with uncertainty. The biker could feel their eyes on him, both of them silently waiting for him to give them some kind of reassurance. But there was no reassurance to give. The danger was still out there, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. He couldn't promise them safety, not yet. But he could promise them that he wouldn't stop fighting. They weren't alone in this anymore. He would make sure of that. As they drove on, the biker's thoughts were clouded with the weight of the coming confrontation. They weren't out of danger, and the men who had been after them weren't going to let up. But he had a plan now, even if he wasn't sure what it looked like yet. He just needed to get Sarah and Emily to safety. And when that time came, he would make sure no one ever hurt them again. The road ahead seemed endless, but the biker's resolve didn't waver. He knew he was running out of time, but he also knew one thing for sure. He would never back down. Not now. Not ever. The car sped through the early morning mist, its headlights cutting through the fog as the biker kept his eyes on the road ahead. The last few days had been a blur, each moment filled with uncertainty and danger. Sarah and Emily were silent in the back seat, their eyes heavy with exhaustion but also with a quiet hope. They had been through hell, but they were still alive, still together, and that was enough for now. The biker's mind was focused on one thing, getting them to safety. He didn't know where that safety was, but he would find it. The driver, who had become their reluctant ally, glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice thick with anxiety. The biker didn't answer right away. He didn't know how much farther, either. He had no destination in mind, just a vague hope that they could outrun their past. "Keep going," the biker finally said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll stop when we have to." The driver nodded, but it was clear that the unease in his eyes wasn't going away. The miles passed by in silence, the road stretching out endlessly before them. The biker's mind wandered back to the confrontation they had narrowly escaped, to the men who had been hunting them for so long. The fight wasn't over, but they had won this round. The thought of that gave him some peace, but it wasn't enough. He knew the real battle was still ahead. As they drove on, the biker's eyes kept scanning the road behind them. He knew the men who had been chasing them wouldn't give up. The biker had seen the kind of men they were, ruthless, persistent, willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. And they weren't going to stop until Sarah and Emily were back in their hands. The thought made his blood run cold. He couldn't let that happen. Not again. As the sun started to rise, the biker began. to see a glimmer of hope. The road they were on seemed to lead somewhere, a small town in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was a place to stop, a place to regroup. They needed food, rest, and to plan their next move. The biker's grip on the seat tightened as they neared the town. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, but he knew they couldn't keep running forever. They had to face their past. They had to stop looking over their shoulder. They had to fight. The car pulled into the outskirts of the town, and the biker took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't used to being in one place for too long. He had spent most of his life on the move, always running from one problem or another. But now, with Sarah and Emily, he had something worth staying for. He couldn't afford to keep running. They were safe for now, but that safety wouldn't last if they didn't find a way to end this. The biker turned to the driver, his eyes hard. "Find us a place to stay. Somewhere quiet. We'll figure out what comes next." The driver nodded, his eyes still filled with apprehension. "Right. I know a place." The biker gave him a curt nod, then turned to Sarah and Emily in the back seat. "We'll be all right," he said, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. Sarah gave him a small, tired smile. "I believe you," she said softly. Emily, who had been unusually quiet, looked up at him. Her eyes, full of trust, made something inside the biker twist. He wasn't used to being needed. He wasn't used to being someone's hero. But he couldn't deny the responsibility he felt now. He had made a promise. And no matter what, he wasn't going to break it. The car stopped in front of a small, inconspicuous motel. It was quiet, off the beaten path, and the perfect place to lay low for a while. The biker didn't hesitate. He opened the door and stepped out, scanning the area. The town was quiet, and the streets were empty, but the biker knew they couldn't afford to relax. He had learned the hard way that safety was an illusion. He didn't let his guard down as they made their way inside, but he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The motel clerk was an older man, a quiet figure behind the desk who barely acknowledged them as they checked in. The biker paid for the room, then led Sarah and Emily to the back of the building, where their room was tucked away. Once inside, the biker closed the door and locked it behind them. He stood for a moment, just looking at the two of them. Sarah and Emily were safe for now, but he knew that the danger wasn't over. The past still had a hold on them. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a moment of peace. He had kept his promise. And in that moment, that was enough. The sun was rising higher in the sky, and the day stretched out before them, filled with uncertainty, but also with the possibility of something more. For the first time in a long time, the biker felt like he had a future worth fighting for. He wasn't sure where the road would lead next, but he was ready to face it. And no matter what came, he would be there, standing between Sarah and Emily and the darkness that still haunted them. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and that was all that mattered. In this gripping tale of survival and loyalty, we dive deep into the world of Hell's Angels stories, where the biker's journey of protecting a mother and daughter is filled with intense action, danger, and a promise that cannot be broken. As the biker faces enemies in pursuit and navigates through relentless obstacles, this story takes you through the harsh realities of the road, showcasing the strength, resilience, and determination of those who fight for their loved ones. With each twist and turn, the biker's commitment to keeping Sarah and Emily safe from the violent world of Hell's Angels stories becomes more intense. As the danger escalates, the biker is forced to confront his past and protect those who depend on him, even when the odds are stacked against him. These Hell's Angels stories are more than just battles on the road. They're about finding redemption and a promise kept no matter the cost. As Sarah and Emily get closer to safety, the biker's personal struggle to face his darkest fears becomes intertwined with his dedication to protecting them. The adrenaline-pumping events and emotional depth of this Hell's Angels story will leave you at the edge of your seat, wondering what happens next as the biker fights to end the threat once and for all. Through these Hell's Angels stories, we explore themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the lengths one man will go to in order to keep those he cares about safe. From intense confrontations to moments of vulnerability, this story shows the power of strength, trust, and the will to survive in a world where danger never stops chasing. Through it all, one thing remains clear. The biker's fight for Sarah and Emily isn't just a mission. It's a fight for a future where they can live free from fear, and the shadow of the Hells Angels stories that follow them fades into the past.